Okay, picking it right back up. Here we go. We just talked about being aware of what you're going to need to do for this week. So now we can move on. I wanted to just draw your attention to a couple of things in the chapters that I asked you to read. This information is more about kind of like thinking about how you're going to set up kind of the information around your research and how you're going to make it matter and the rhetorical choices you'll make to introduce us to some important things. So keep that in mind. I do feel a little strange kind of starting with this information instead of going right into like, here are reminders of how to do quoted material and the rules about quotation mechanics, but we'll get there because I do want you to kind of have fun with this and look at this creatively and consider how to be rhetorically effective. So here are some thoughts that I have for you, and also I guess some warnings in a sense from those 3 chapters I asked you to read in the Norton. Chapter 41 on defining, I just want you to be thoughtful and judicious about definitions in your writing, okay? If there are important things for us to know, like if you're working with kind of concepts that we as your audience, me and the class, might not be aware of, then absolutely work to define things. I'm hoping, though, that you won't just like pull from Merriam-Webster or dictionary.com, right? Like find a more complex and interesting way to present definitions, particularly if it's in some of your academic research. But also make sure that you're not just defining for the sake of biller, all right? I cannot tell you how many essays I've read in the past that do that define things like, according to Merriam-Webster, culture is defined as, or cultural competency is defined as, according to dictionary.com. A, those places are, just like super simple definitions, and B, because we have some kind of established understanding of what we're talking about as a class, like maybe that's not something that's necessary. And then you'll note here, which I will read to you and laugh, I guess, at myself a little bit inside, but now I feel weird. For the love of all that is good and holy, do not start your essay with Merriam-Webster defines something as whatever, okay? That is a high school-esque move you've been taught because it gives you something to kind of set up and respond to, but there are just so many better ways to begin an essay than with Merriam-Webster defines something, okay? That's actually kind of a joke among professors, all right? Like when we see essays that start that way and we're around each other, there's an eye roll and a laugh, just like how can we have this beginning every single time, all right? So avoid that. You don't need to be scared of definitions, but only use them if they're necessary and important, okay? If they have some kind of rhetorical significance to the setup of your content. So keep that in mind. The next thing I wanted to point out in chapter 42 on describing, don't fear details. So this is another moment where I want to say you should be using first person. You should be speaking in an I voice because this is your research, your argument or your exploration. It's from your perspective, so you should be speaking in an I voice, meaning if you have anecdotes, which again is just a story, or personal experiences to support your claim or claims, use them, and think about what kind of effect that you'll have on your audience in terms of the way that you tell the story. And I think there are some interesting and solid examples in the Norton that kind of talk about the difference between like objective description versus subjective, so where it's kind of like fact-based versus impression-based, right? And I think that that's super relevant to consider and think about. Like, do you just hit us with the factual story, like chronologically of like what happened, that kind of pushes us toward logos or logic, like that kind of appeal? Or are we looking at kind of the emotional effects of a situation that would cause us to have some kind of emotional reaction as audience. I think you'll find examples of these descriptions in the 2 essay samples that I have for you, particularly in the beginning. And we can think about the effect that these particular authors wanted in making those choices. And I think it's obvious, and I think that it's good if it's obvious. Okay, yeah. Don't fear the details. Chapter 45 on narrating. Just wanted to point out a couple of things, even though this feels more like this chapter feels to me more about like if you were writing kind of something that was like a fictional story, but we can still pull some solid information from it. So there's notes on transitions, on considering pertinent details, and the potential of beginning and ending your essay with a narrative, all right, or an anecdote. So keep that in mind as your options, all right? Remember, we are avoiding the traditional 5-paragraph essay of intro with your thesis, supporting points, and then a conclusion that's restating everything. Remember, you can go back and watch the recording of me talking about those outline interpretations to remind you, like, that is there. Go back and look at it. Look at the document. Look at my explanation. We are not doing the traditional stuff that you've been taught in the past about what an essay should look like. Break out of that and use or take advantage of some of these strategies that are suggested to you in the text and by some of the samples I'm going to show you. So don't fear the details. Don't fear narrating. It's going to be worth your time. I'm watching my husband walk through our house right now. Hi.
Hello.
All right. Okay. Trying to make sure I'm not going over the 15-minute limit on this particular section of our lecture today. But I am going to go ahead and pull up our outline example. So what we have here is an outline that one of my students did in 2018, as you can see. This is also, I just want to go ahead and tell you, when we were using a different textbook, but you have access to the outline interpretations that I want you to use, and what's being kind of demonstrated here by my former student. The lead that he's saying here is, another way to say introduction. The previous textbook used the word lead, but he went ahead and gave me an example of what he would be attempting for his lead. As you can see or read, there is some second person in here that we had to edit out. But generally, the details are really solid, and now the introduction's done, right? The lead is done, even as a part of the outline. But then as you move forward, you'll see that he added in wanting to define wildlife, right, and its significance and biodiversity, because there are different definitions there. So he knew he was going to add that in to his particular exploration. Then we have what has been said, and I'm asking you, and this will be explained at the end of this lecture, I'm going to ask you to demonstrate that you know how to integrate quotations into your text, and how to set it up and then respond. So you'll see here there are examples of that. And then there is kind of what's happening with an attempted thesis statement and some thoughts about kind of concluding. But then he added, and as I asked from former classes, I had them do prep questions for when we met for conferences, kind of wanting to know what kind of feedback they wanted and what they weren't super confident about. But this was one of the strongest outlines that I received, because it was one that was kind of like the least full of BS, right? Because you have some of it already written. and you have examples of the student kind of demonstrating how he would integrate quotations. So in this what has been said section, I do just want to kind of read it and show you what's going on here. We have Kritzer and his colleagues state, and that apostrophe should not be there. Kritzer and his colleagues state, comma, begin quote, many habitats provide other benefits to species that do not use that habitat directly, period, end quote. This is something that needs to be said and understood more by people. Society has an out of sight, out of mind mindset. And again, you see that this student does fall into the usage of like people and society, which we worked on later, but demonstrating that he knew that he needed a signal phrase, right, with the names of the people in the sentence. And the one thing that I did suggest to him is that he would probably need a page number here, unless there weren't page numbers. But generally, you're going to need a page number for the citation there. So again, outline, it's like it doesn't need to be perfect. But I do want to see you demonstrating that you know what to do and you know where the punctuation goes and you know that you need a signal phrase and some follow-up after you set up part of a quotation, okay? But that's part of his what has been said, and then he goes into considering like a thesis and how he's going to support it here. I will upload this document so that you can look at it, but I'd love for you to use this as an example of what your outline might look like. But again, this student was exploring, okay? So an argument's going to look a little different, and keep that in mind. But as long as you're following the outline interpretations, which are, in my opinion, like full of details and questions to consider, I think you're going to do great. You do just fine. Okay? Awesome. I'm going to take a pause now before we move on to talking about actual essay samples. Okay. See you in a second.